I'm going to tell you the story of Peter and the Wolf. Now, usually before this piece begins, the speaker explains how each person or animal in the story is described by a certain instrument of the orchestra. I'm sure you know all that already, haven't you? Right.
Charlie Baker Dog, this is London Tower. Runway number 10.
So there's been lots and lots and lots of talk about web fonts over the last couple of years as the technology has really sort of made its way into the world, and it's starting to move past just the issue of web fonts to the way type looks on other kinds of screens. And this is all really great. It's an opportunity for words that people get to be beautiful while at the same time being accessible and scalable and searchable. And those are all really, really super things. It's not quite all the way there yet, which is frustrating when people start grappling with integrating fonts into online projects. It's been a moving landscape for the last couple of years, and it probably still will be, because of course support of the different components of this solution is still evolving and improving, whether it's the way the browsers render fonts, the way the foundries improve the quality of the fonts that are being delivered, and the features that can be supported. But as all of this shifts, there's still a need for the designers who are working on the web and on screen-based devices to also challenge their assumptions about how type works, because the simple reality is all of these fonts that are suddenly made available are not necessarily great choices, and everyone who's designing for this medium has to really come to understand what is suitable choices for this kind of environment. Now, the first issue that we talk about a lot in the type industry is on-screen rendering, hinting and pixelization and rasterization, and all these things that affect the way this ideal shape of the letter actually comes out on screen. Because, of course, this is what we always want letters to look like. You know, the beauty of a typeface design that shows clear details and straight lines and beautiful curves. Well, the reality of what happens with type on screen starts with something like this, where the software takes those smooth, perfect outlines and breaks them down into pixels of varying hues and values to create this illusion of the type. So this is sort of a typical size that you would read for body of text, blown up so you can see the effect of how much it breaks down. But it's not just what the software is doing, of course. There's the effect of what the actual physical screen is doing to the type to render it as well. So we have LCD screens which can manipulate the individual RGB color channels to try to improve this illusion of the clear type. And this is at sort of the higher end of the spectrum of what can happen to perfect this experience for the reader. But on the other end, which is becoming more and more prominent, is what happens on like basic e-ink devices, where there are only a couple of steps that can be made to try to go from the white of the page to the black of the type. To choose typefaces for this environment, you generally have to understand that there are some challenges to all of these devices, and there's not a single solution that's going to work across the board perfectly, but rather it's a continuum of what's best suited for what. And you need to make choices that often span that continuum if you realize that could be a long life cycle to the content that you're designing. Now, in the most basic sense, there's a difference between the general rendering of text in the Mac OS versus Windows. And I think designers have been used to this for a long time because it's affected the appearance of the basic core fonts that we've had for a long time. It's becoming more of an issue as we have more typefaces choices to work with, that the Mac tends toward being a little bit fuzzier and a little bit heavier, while Windows favors being a little bit lighter and a little bit crisper. There are pros and cons to both of these approaches, so it's not that one is good and the other is bad, but they're both out there, and designers who are specifying typography have to understand that there's this range of potential outcomes. And then, of course, as the proliferation of different kinds of devices grows, we have to think about what happens from one device to another, where the quality of the type may be really, really great on a high-resolution screen like the iPhone, or it could be quite coarse on something like an e-ink reader or a less expensive phone than the iPhone. So the first thing to really consider is what kind of typefaces are available that are suitable to this range of devices and environments and ways of using typography. And the thing to remember is that, yes, there are all these great typefaces that foundries are rushing to get out the door, but this is the legacy of decades and decades of typefaces being designed for various purposes. Type is often designed with specific technical implementations in mind, whether it was originally for foundry typesetting in metal, hot metal typesetting, photo typesetting, the early digital tools. The design of typefaces often responds to these challenges, and those designs enter the toolkit of what designers have available, and they become popular and people are used to them. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're as successful in all media. So we have to really look at how they behave in the situation at hand. Now, we're lucky that, of course, web fonts have been around for a while, and we're beginning to see typefaces specifically targeting this environment too, which is great, and it gives us a lot of possibilities. But what should we look for in the older typefaces who are still being propagated as we go along? Well, one of the most basic features that I think is a new challenge to people grappling with a range of typographic choices on the web comes down to just the simple proportions of available typefaces. Working with system fonts that have been available, like Arial and Verdana and Georgia and so for years, they've had a pretty similar proportion in terms of height. Well, with a lot of other typefaces that are available, they have different relationships within the size of a typeface that affect how big a typeface looks. For instance, classic book typefaces like Times or Bembo, they have what we call an X height, which you can see particularly in the Gaudi up here, for instance. The size of the lowercase letters is pretty small compared to a typeface like Verdana. Overall, that makes the typeface look much smaller when they're set at the same size, which affects the overall texture of type. If you're going to begin mixing typefaces within a layout, you have to be able to anticipate the fact that there is this apparent difference in the texture that comes from the basic style of the typeface. You can see an example here of what happens when you mix typefaces that have different proportions, where Rhatigan and Neue Helvetica have a pretty generous size that makes a passage of text set with a solid line height look very, very dense. While the letters themselves are quite clear because of that size, the overall texture closes up. With something like Gill Sans and Garamond, you have more air, and it seems like there's a larger line height, but actually it's just the size of the letters themselves, which are a little bit smaller in that main area of activity from the baseline to the X height. Now, if we zoom in a little bit more to the details of specific letters and how they behave on screen, as a general rule of thumb, very, very crisp vertical and horizontal features look great on screen, of course, because the screen is a gridded environment because of the arrangement of pixels. Now, typefaces that were designed for other media often have very, very subtle curvature built into the designs. In designs like Optima and Palatino, for instance, these helped create a little bit of elegance, and they help to survive some of the roughness of printing on paper from metal or photo typesetting. Well, these elegant, subtle curvatures can create problems on screen. Now, luckily, at text sizes, they often flatten out into crisp rows of pixels, which is great. But when you begin to increase the scale and they get bigger, you start jumping from one row of pixels to another as they try to render that subtle curve, which becomes problematic. So the issue of the size that you're using your type has huge ramifications to the way it's going to look on screen. And it comes down to the details of specific typefaces. For instance, on the New Yorker site, which looks really, really great for the most part, there's this distracting aspect of that signature New Yorker typeface that you can see in the Mad Men headline, especially in that capital A. You know, there's a slight tilt to the letters, and you just jump a row of pixels. Now, if the entire design wasn't so strong, and if the overall text appearance wasn't so good, this could be really distracting. As it is, it's something that just becomes a part of the overall texture and you can let it go. But if you know that you have typefaces that are going to introduce some issues, you kind of have to make sure that your other design choices can support those quirks that may pop up. When we look at typefaces that do perform really well on screen, there's still some significant difference that can happen that you can get from the details of specific letter forms. Rhatigan and Neue Helvetica both read really well. They have a generous X height. There's a lot of air within the typefaces for the most part. Rhatigan opens up a little bit more, the way the lowercase e opens out rather than turns up the way it does in Helvetica. You get a little bit more air between the R and the O, just because of the width of the individual letters. And it leads to a very different appearance on screen, even though the legibility may be comparable. And these are the kinds of details that people who are more used to dealing with a wide array of typefaces factor in. And I think for designers who've been working primarily on the web, the subtle distinctions that can multiply to create very different effects is a new and potentially complex issue if you don't start getting used to looking at what happens as you swap different typefaces in and out of a layout and evaluating how they behave. Another big issue is with this wider range of choices, you have different kinds of families with relationships within them. Now, for instance, if you just look at the Roman version of a typeface to see whether or not it's a good choice for a given project, it may feel like there's generous spacing, there's air, things are clear. But what happens with the italic and the bold? Different kinds of emphasis within the text may call for you to pull in these different styles. So you have to get used to looking at the clarity of the italic styles and the bold italic and whatever's available, and make sure that the entire family is as fit for purpose as any given face. Because of the dynamic nature of online text, you won't necessarily know at the outset when that emphasis gets called in. It just becomes another option within a spec that may appear when you least expect it. The flip side of this about what's really great is families that have a wide array of styles. So for something like Univer, for instance, you have the ability to manipulate weight and texture and the hierarchy of messages within a text in a way that wasn't really possible before from that very blunt jump from, say, Verdana to Verdana Bold. Well, now you can do smaller steps, so you can have some subtler distinctions. You can change things depending on the scale in a way that maintains a tighter relationship. And that kind of potential really makes for some of the excitement with all of these choices that are now available for different projects. And now, print designers for a long time have been getting used to what's possible with dynamic open type features and typefaces. And they haven't really been a factor of web fonts so far, but support for that is beginning to increase. And we know that a requirement to support OpenType features is built into the EPUB spec, which is beginning to make its way out in the world. And I think that web fonts are likely to follow. So there are other degrees of subtlety that are going to be possible to manipulate as well, whether it's ligatures that help the reading experience, or just style features like ranging versus aligning figures, or swashes and alternates. So the array of options is going to become wider and provide more potential for what can happen to make text special. But again, you have to know that they're coming so that you can think about how to take advantage of these features. Now, on top of just choosing a typeface, there's also the responsibility that you have as designers to use the typefaces well and to make smart choices about taking a typeface that's available and not pushing it further than it can really handle within this medium. So, for instance, if we go back to this notion of the apparent size of text that's specific to the proportions within a design, well, you can compensate for those differences when you begin to mix typefaces, say by, in a case like this, specifying the line height much more specifically. If you're doing everything entirely in proportional values, well, typeset at, say, 12 pixels across two different typefaces may appear at very different sizes. You can manipulate the size of one of those typefaces so they appear to be the same, but if your line height is specified proportionally, that's going to alter as well. So taking a look at what happens as you try out different typefaces may require a little bit more of a nimbler approach to how you specify the way this text is called in to a web project or any kind of a screen project to make sure that the end result, which is what the reader really cares about, really is suitable and doesn't distract or take away from that experience. As a general rule of thumb, I certainly recommend generosity when setting text for any kind of a screen-based device. It is a rough environment. It tends to be pretty coarse. A little bit of extra space between the lines, a little bit more size to all the type is going to be great for the reader. I mean, of course, what's fantastic about having live text for projects like this is that a user can scale it. They can change the size. But of course, you want them to have the best impression right at the outset so that they don't have to make the effort to change things. So if you really think about serving up the best version right at the start, because real estate isn't necessarily as precious because it's a web page. The screen can run a little longer. An ebook can run a couple of extra pages. There's not as much of a penalty for going big. So if you get it right off the start, for the broadest array of readers, you're off to a good start. The color options that you work with on screen have really, really huge implications. Now, this is not new to anyone who's been working in design because, of course, color relationships are always critical to the readability of text in any medium. But working with fonts on screen, we have to go back to the sense of that illusion that's created when a typeface outline is broken down into pixels. It's often not just a matter of a pixel being on or off. It falls somewhere within the middle of those steps between white and black. Well, when you have less contrast between the foreground color of your type and the background color, you don't get as clear an illusion of the shape of that letter. If they can't make as many steps from the contour of one to the color of the backgrounds, then you lose legibility and the clarity of the type degrades. So more contrast, as a rule of thumb, is also a great thing if you want to make a good impression right off the bat. Now, as we've been getting used to how type behaves in this environment for a couple of years, and this doesn't just go for Monotype, but for everyone who's releasing typefaces, we're beginning to realize that, yes, some typefaces do work better in this environment. And as we look at what factors influence that, we're beginning to look at manipulating some of the typefaces we have or creating new typefaces that respond really well to those factors. So we've been working on doing what we call the Etexts versions of some of our classic typefaces that we know have some problems on screen. For instance, in this example of Bembo, which is a great classic book face that's enduringly popular, we realized that it needs to be a little bit bigger within the square, maybe a little bit more space between the letters so that there's some more air so that the letters don't collide into one another. A little bit less contrast between the thinnest parts of the letter and the thicker parts. Well, that leads to a pretty dramatic difference overall, but actually when you see it on screen, it carries across the same personality. And this is very similar to what had been happening in typefaces before the digital era, or even the photo typesetting era, where there were slight differences to a design depending on what size would be used to set text. And we're not just doing this for the classic book faces, but we're also looking at other popular typefaces like Helvetica, which already looks great, but there's a possibility to improve it just that little bit more to make it an even better experience. Opening up those spaces a little bit, adding a little bit more room between the letters. So this won't necessarily be the same Helvetica you've been using, but it'll look good. And then there are new typefaces, which we've identified had characteristics that work well on screen. So with a little bit of engineering effort, they look as good as can possibly be. For instance, Malabar, which has really, really straight lines in the horizontal and vertical, and nice crisp details that are pretty easy to render as they're transformed into pixels. And while you see that there's a lot of personality and detail to that design, you can see how it actually holds up in a relatively coarse environment. Like this is one of the typefaces in the Nook Reader, and it looks fantastic, and the personality really comes across. And this comes down to that marriage of the design of the typeface itself and the software engineering effort that goes into it to make it to make it display as well as possible for the situation. So of course, we want to keep offering great products, and every foundry wants to keep offering great products, but it depends on users who choose on these typefaces, testing them out, looking really closely at how they perform, and giving us feedback about what they need. And it depends on people doing really great stuff with the typefaces so that we can see more and more people use the type, and we really get to understand what the possibilities are. Because if you show us what's possible, of course, we can respond with even more possibilities of what you can do with it. And with any luck, that's how it'll all work out. So go out and make amazing stuff, and let us see how it turns out. Thanks.